Officer Nero will face an administrative review by the police department. We want again ask the citizens to be patient and to allow the entire process to come to a conclusion. In the case of any disturbance in the city, we are prepared to respond. We will protect our neighborhoods, our businesses, and the people of our city. Again, that's the mayor of Baltimore, Stephanie Rawlings. Blake, I want to bring in with the conversation community activist and Professor Lawrence Brown from Morgan State University in Baltimore. Professor, we know that you, along with many others, have been anticipating and waiting for all of these cases to work through the court system. Now you have one hung jury and a trial earlier, and now a not guilty. Your reaction?
Well, you know, you said that our mayor said that the American criminal justice system, this is what it is for us. But I would say that this system that we have doesn't work for African Americans. There's disproportionality in arrest and sentencing for African Americans. And then when cops are shooting our children, when they're shooting our people, cops are not punished disproportionately. So I think right now there's a great deal of anxiety and anger that I feel personally, and I believe many others feel, because Freddie Gray's death was actually a very traumatic experience for many of us, and there's not going to be any justice in these first two trials that we've seen. And I think many of us are beginning to doubt that there will be any justice in any of those trials that are to come.
Well, going back to the mayor's statement, she pointed out, as we know, police officers must be afforded the same justice system as every other citizen in this case. You bring up the disproportionate number of arrests and deaths of unarmed citizens who, in many cases, are African American. You have a judge in this case who's African American, who oversaw this case, a bench trial, and decided there was not enough evidence here to prove guilt of this officer's role in the death of Freddie Gray.
Well, you know, two things. Number one, the witnesses, the civilian witnesses who saw what happened to Freddie Gray, they were not allowed to testify at this trial. So you have a trial that doesn't incorporate the witnesses who saw what actually happened. The judge turned off the audio on the video of looking at what happened to Freddie Gray. And finally, even in the defense of Officer Nero, you have an officer or the attorney saying, hey, this was a baby officer after 2 years on the force. He doesn't know how to buckle a seatbelt yet. And I just think that's a slap in the face of people here in Baltimore who live in a very hyper-segregated city and disinvested red line black communities, to tell us that officers are baby officers who don't know how to buckle in a suspect. It's very dubious, very disappointing decision here today.
When you look at this situation from the very start, when officers, going back to April 12th, officers on their bicycles attempted to stop Freddie Gray and another man. Police catch up with Mr. Gray. They arrest him, but there's never been any proof that there was reasonable cause to pull him over on the bike or to investigate him in the first place. They found a small knife, which was legal for him to carry. And when you look at Officer Nero's role in this, according to prosecutors, he was part of this initial arrest that should never have happened. There was never probable cause to arrest Mr. Gray in the first place, which of course set off a series of events which included this trauma to his spine, a broken vertebrae, which ultimately resulted in his death. And we're watching Officer Nero. This is, let me tell our audience what you're seeing here. Officer Nero being escorted from the courtroom after the not guilty verdict, a judge deciding that there was not enough evidence to convict Officer Nero. His partner, Officer Garrett Miller, has testified that he was actually the person who detained Gray himself, not Officer Nero. Nevertheless, the prosecution had said that Nero did not have probable cause to arrest Freddie Gray and failed to put a seatbelt on a shackled prisoner. We need to not forget the fact that Freddie Gray was already shackled when he was put in the back of that van and transported by police. Those were the charges Officer Nero was facing. You see him under heavy security watch, being escorted into what I'm going to guess is a parking garage so that he can leave here. But the defense has always said that there was minimal exposure or minimal role in all of this for Officer Nero. They say that his role in it was negligible. They said that he never touched Mr. Gray. In fact, he touched him only once. Let me clarify that. His attorneys say that he only touched Freddie Gray once. The defense argued that the officer followed his training. So we're watching the video of Officer Nero. Professor, what do you expect the reaction to be now that you have one hung jury and now this acquittal from the judge in this case?
Well, I think you'll have an increasing sense of really frustration against the criminal justice system here. You mentioned that there was an African-American judge. We have a black mayor. We had a black policeman. But, you know, American policing was founded on slave patrols. This system of policing has been always exacting disproportionate violence against African-Americans throughout the history of this country. So I don't think that, you know, people here who are living in the communities where there's a high level of police aggression, a high level of police brutality, they're not going to be happy with this. I think there's going to have to be a lot of discussions about the criminal justice system right here in Baltimore, Maryland, whether or not it can, in fact, deliver justice for people living in disinvested red line black communities. And remember, prosecutors are used to working with the police. So is it even possible that they're going to deliver the best case that they can deliver, that they're going to be the strongest prosecutors they can when they're working with police every day?
But looking at the state attorney,
we have.
But that's an interesting question you're posing. As you pointed out, the mayor is African American. Baltimore State's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, is the person who announced the charges. She's African American. So because this verdict did not go down in the way that you and many others wanted it to, you believe that there's a systemic conspiracy that also then involves African-American leaders of your city and even prosecutors?
No, it doesn't have to be a conspiracy. It is the way the system is designed. Remember, we're talking about Supreme Court decisions. We're talking about laws and legal structures. So regardless of the people that you put in place, this system is not designed to work with or work for the interests of people living in disinvested red line black communities. The people you're talking about have a higher level of class, higher level of standard of living. But for poor African Americans living in disinvested red line black communities, this system isn't designed to work for them. And I think many of us are very clear about that today.
But here you have a case where 6 officers, some of which are African American as well, were brought in on charges, arrested and charged with the death of Freddie Gray. And the state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, African American, vowed to find justice and pursue justice in this case. Is it possible here that, for example, with Officer Nero, I'll point that out, that there was not enough evidence to convict him, and that perhaps the other cases will play out in what you will see as what I'm asking you, the initial concern here was there a sweep? Was there a sweep, and you brought in all of these officers who played various roles in this, allegedly, and that maybe there was an overreach to bring what is the right justice to Freddie Gray? Someone was responsible here. He did not break his own spine. He did not sever his own vertebrae. He did not put his own body in the back of that van. So there has to be some responsibility here. But in this case, an African-American judge says this individual, there's not enough evidence for a conviction.
Right. And I mean, I think what you see is that in the defense for the police so far, there's been this constant stream of police officers saying, well, we don't know we weren't really trained on how to buckle suspects in. That isn't really our responsibility. So you see the police shirking responsibility. You see them saying that, hey, this guy was a baby officer after 2 years on the job. Is there any job in America where you're still considered a baby employee after 2 years?
So
and
is this more about police
no.
culture versus black or white? Is this about, in your opinion, that there is a tremendous amount of latitude given to officers, to your point, where an officer is referred to as a baby police officer or someone in training, when this could ultimately end in the death of an individual, which in this case was Freddie Gray?
Well, I mean, of course it's about policing culture, but it's also about the way black victims are viewed in our society. We dehumanize them. Actually, even in the media, we saw here that it was many journalists here referred to as the Freddie Gray trials, as if Freddie Gray was on trial. And so again, if we're looking at the victims, who deserves justice in America? Freddie Gray was treated as if he did not deserve justice. And I think that's the tragedy here today. And the criminal justice system apparently is not really designed to bring justice for victims like Freddie.
We're going to get going, but I have to go back again, though, to the core of my question. Is this case about police culture? When you look at, and we can put the screen up of the officers charged in connection with Freddie Gray's death, you see a number of African-American faces there, 3 African-Americans, 3 white officers. Is it also a conversation, and many of the things that you've noted about Baltimore and the people that are often dehumanized or viewed as underclass, that is obviously an important conversation. Is this, though, also about police culture, where you can have an African-American officer also be charged in connection with the death of a black person?
Well, I mean, here's what you have to understand about Baltimore in terms of police culture. Nearly 90% of our officers do not live in Baltimore City. So you're having suburban values and mores that influence the policing strategy of nearly 90% of the police force. African-American are white. Our police officers don't live in our communities. They don't live in Freddie Gray's community. So there's no way that
but that's not unique to Baltimore.
That's
a conversation that is being had around this country. That is not an exclusive issue facing Baltimore. You have,
but that is a part of police culture. There's no way. For instance, if you watch The Wire, you see officers go into a community, and when they hurt a boy in the eye, the residents in the show begin to throw something at the police. So officers who view that show before they begin to police here in Baltimore, they're looking at something and they're saying, wait a minute, those people are our enemies. And I think that's what sort of feeds the culture of policing, that people living in red line communities should be afraid of them. And I think that's a very underlying part of police culture.
What we know is obviously this Freddie Gray case and many others, Walter Scott, the list goes on and on. The case involving the young man Laquan in Chicago right now, where a judge wants Rahm Emanuel to testify on the so-called code of silence that may exist in the police department there. But I guess the core of what you are saying is, yes, in many cities, not just Baltimore, officers do not live in the neighborhoods they police, but that could be applied to teachers as well. In some of the hardest hit areas, you have teachers who will not live in that community, but choose to go in that community to teach those children. So you may not live in the community, but there is a bond that can happen. And many police departments, including Baltimore, are pledging to do just that. You don't have to live in the community, and the people don't have to be dehumanized. There seems to be an effort, according to your mayor, and you can tell me if you believe it's effective or not, to make that change, that there can be a human connection and you don't have to live exactly next door to the people you're policing.
Well, perhaps so, but there's research that indicates that the more segregated a city is, the higher the level of excessive force complaints against police officers. Baltimore is in the top top 8 hyper-segregated cities in America. So is Chicago. So is Flint. So is Detroit. So in these cities, again, segregation is influencing the bias that officers have against the people they're policing. And I would argue that that is absolutely a part of the culture of policing here in Baltimore and elsewhere across America.
In the end, what do you believe the reaction? I'm sure you and other city leaders are bracing and advising people to, again, let cooler heads prevail. We saw the most difficult part of this following the death of Mr. Gray that impacted the city with some violence, but mostly peaceful protests, but still scary moments for that community.
I'm sorry, say that again?
I was asking you, what are you calling on the people of Baltimore to do in reaction to this verdict?
Well, I don't know that I have a call in terms of their reaction, but I know there's unresolved trauma. I know that people are hurting, and we've never dealt with that. I've created a plan that actually we should go out and send out social workers, mental health workers, public health workers, and actually go door to door, connecting people with resources, helping them to make sure that they have opportunity. But instead, we seem to believe that a riot mobilization of our police, at least on the last verdict, I'm not sure what they're doing here today, seems to be a more effective way of response from the city's perspective. And I just think that's wrong. I think our residents here in this city deserve to have their pain understood and respected. And I think a lot of us are really hurting right now. It remains to be seen whether or not our public health department and other officials in this city will mobilize to actually treat the underlying trauma. And police brutality is a part of that trauma.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for your time. We greatly appreciate it. Let me go back to MSNBC Chief Legal Correspondent